II Museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. It's my great pleasure to be with you today and to be joined by three of the world's, certainly this country, but also the world's preeminent scholars on the Pacific War, but much more than that. We have with us to commemorate and to explore the Battle of Midway, leadership and legacy, John Parshall, Craig Symonds, and Trent Hone. Trent Hone is an authority on the U.S. Navy of the early 20th century and a leader in the application of complexity science to organizational design. Trent's got a wonderful library behind him, not just physically, but to his own credit. We actually had the pleasure of having Trent down here for our Guadalcanal Symposium a few years back. I encourage all to find that on our YouTube or Vimeo links. Trent is here with Craig Symonds, who's another friend of the museum. Craig is Professor Emeritus at the United States Naval Academy, where he taught naval history for 30 years, including 4 years as the chair at the History Department. Craig has written World War II at Sea. He's written a book on the Battle of Midway. His Operation Neptune on the crossing of the English Channel in June of 1944 is a must-read. He's also been here to the museum for conferences, symposia, standalone presentations, and even traveled with our educational travel programs overseas. And of course, we have John Parshall with us. John is very familiar to all of our loyal friends and followers. John has been a pretty regular participant and presenter at our international conferences on World War II. He's been involved in our overseas tours. I had the pleasure of going over to Pearl Harbor for the 75th with him, but he's also traveling the world jet setting with some of my other colleagues to other areas. His book, Shattered Sword, The Untold Story of the Battle of Midway, is still one of the go-to that he co-authored with Anthony Tully. And it really does bring a lot of information to light and still stands on strong ground some 15 years after it was published. But to get us started, we've asked that John give a brief overview of the battle itself before we bring in Trent and Craig to provide the roundtable conversation and put this very important battle in a broader context. So, John, the floor is yours.
All right. I'd just like to take a few minutes to share what I call the Cliff Notes version of the Battle of Midway, just to give a little more context to some of our viewers who may not be familiar with the battle. Basically, the Pacific War for the United States, of course, starts off on 7 December 1941 at Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was really just the first component in a much larger plan of campaign that the Japanese initiated that ended up spreading across the entire Western Pacific Basin, from places as far-flung as Hawaii all the way over to Malaya and Singapore. And so what you see developing in the next few months is a series of actions aimed at capturing the oil-rich areas of Sumatra, Java, and Indonesia. And so by the time we get to around the March 1942 timeframe, just 4 months into this conflict, the Japanese have carved out for themselves one of the largest empires in the history of mankind. The problem for the Japanese at this point becomes, well, what's next? And they explored a number of options. The first being, let's just hunker down into a defensive posture right now. They looked at potentially invading Australia. They looked at moving into the Indian Ocean. But at the end of the day, the two options that really sort of came to prominence were first, potentially moving down the line of the Solomon Islands to try to cut off the supply lines to Australia, or to move into the Central Pacific with an operation aimed eventually at the capture of Hawaii. And so these two options came to blows in early April of 1942, with Admiral Yamamoto, the commander of the combined fleet, in favor of the Central Pacific option, going up against his boss, Admiral Nagano in Tokyo, who was in favor of the Southwest Pacific direction. And in the end, Yamamoto wins that strategic debate. The island that he is selecting for his operation is the atoll of Midway, which is at the far end of the Hawaiian island chain. Reason being that he thinks he can precipitate a carrier battle here relatively easily. And if he can capture Midway, that gives him the ability to potentially work his way down the Hawaiian island chain and eventually take Oahu. So let's take a little look at the battle plan that Yamamoto and his staff end up cranking out. It's enormously complex and envisions not only carrier operations aimed at Midway, but also operations aimed up in the Aleutian Islands, backed by battleship forces and invasion forces as well. The notion is that once Midway and the Aleutians are neutralized, the two carrier forces and the battleships from the Aleutians are going to move down to the south. All of these formations are going to be joined together. Simultaneously, the Americans are supposed to sally forth from Pearl Harbor, not only with their carrier forces, but also with their remaining battleships. And then the result of that is going to be a climactic sea battle taking place someplace around Midway, wherein not only the American carrier forces are going to be destroyed, but their battleship forces as well. And the thought is that with those remaining naval assets now having been destroyed, the Americans will have no choice but to come to the bargaining table. Big problem for the Japanese, though, is that unknown to them, their primary operational code, JN25B, has been broken by American cryptographers. And that gives Admiral Chester Nimitz, who's the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, bare time to scrape together the assets that he needs to put together a battle plan and offer battle off of Midway. So in a nutshell, what he intends on doing is flooding the quadrant to the northwest of Midway with submarines. He anticipates that the Japanese carrier force will come in from the northwest. He's going to then position whatever carriers he can scrape up at a place called Point Luck, which is pretty far off to the northeast of the battle site. And so the battle should unfold like this. The submarines are going to do their thing and attack the Japanese. The land-based air power on Midway, likewise, will go out and attack those Japanese carriers, hopefully whittle that force down to size such that he will feel comfortable then committing his carriers to come in and ambush the remaining Japanese force. So that's the battle plan, and that brings us to June 4th itself. Operations initiate much like the Americans had anticipated. The Japanese come in off the northwest, they launch a very powerful strike against the island of Midway, and unknown to the Japanese, the Americans are now lurking off to their northeast. I'm not going to go through the blow-by-blow here, but suffice to say, Midway is attacked and fairly heavily damaged during the course of the morning. Midway's air assets go out and attack the Japanese carriers and are basically shot to pieces by Japan's combat air patrol. Japanese scouting arrangements kind of fall apart during the morning, but at about 7:45 in the morning, a Japanese scout plane finally does detect the Americans. The Japanese carrier force continues to be under attack during the morning, this time by B-17s. There are a series of torpedo plane attacks that occur around 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the morning. And finally, at 10 o'clock in the morning, Kitabutai is sighted by not one, but two different formations of American dive bombers that are coming in from two different directions. So you can see Enterprise's aircraft coming up from the southwest and Yorktown's aircraft coming in from the east and northeast. And the result is at around 10:20 to 10:25, a combined dive bomber attack, which catches the Japanese by surprise and ends up knocking out 3 of their aircraft carriers. So only the carrier Hiryu is left operational after this attack. The initiative is now largely in Japan's court, and so Hiryu counterattacks at this time, hits Yorktown around lunchtime with a dive bomber attack that leaves her pretty heavily damaged, hits her again a couple hours later with a torpedo plane attack, and the result of that is that Yorktown is knocked out of the battle and is abandoned at this point in time. But a couple hours later, the sole remaining carrier, Hiryu, is finally detected by the Americans and attacked around dinner time, knocked out of the battle. And at this point, the Japanese have lost all 4 of their carriers. Yorktown is going to be picked off by an enemy submarine a couple days later. And the result is that the Japanese lose 4 aircraft carriers, the Americans lose 1. And what that does in the broader context of carrier naval power within the Pacific, we go into this battle at a distinct disadvantage in terms of flight decks against the Japanese, but the Americans come out of the battle now having sort of clawed their way back to numerical parity with the Japanese in terms of flight decks. And what that allows the Americans to do is then start to consider, are there other ways and areas that we want to begin counterattack? We now have the ability to take the initiative in this war if we want to. We can get out of this defensive crouch that we've been in for the last 6 months. Where do we want to bring the war to Japan? And the answer to that question is, in just a couple of months' time, the Americans will kick off the campaign at Guadalcanal in August of 1942. And that Guadalcanal campaign, in my opinion, is the most decisive naval campaign of that year. It's going to last for months and do grave damage to the Japanese. So that is the battle in a nutshell. Thanks.
Well, thank you, John. I think we all took bets as to how quickly you could actually get through this very important battle, and you came in on the under, so congrats. Before we get started, I'd like to share with everyone the reason we put this panel together is not just because they're leading authorities or friends of the museum, but as I mentioned, John's book, Shattered Sword, which has been out for some time. But we also have Craig's book, Nimitz at War, Command Leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, that is available now. It was just released. And this September, we have Trent's book, Mastering the Art of Command, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and Victory in the Pacific. So what I'm going to do to start this roundtable discussion is to ask that Craig and Trent, John had talked about the Japanese motivations for this battle, but I'd like you to both answer and then have John come in. What were the American aims for this battle? Was it to stop the bleeding? Was it to have a decisive battle? Was it to end the war? So let's start with Craig first, please.
Sure. Thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate it. And John, congratulations on condensing that down. That Cliff's Notes version, that is fantastic. I really enjoyed that. I wish I'd had that in my class when I was still teaching at the academy. I think it's important to understand from the American perspective on this is the idea of accepting battle in the first place. Now, I know we're going to have to talk about code breaking and what that means. John introduced it, and there's a lot of nuance to that I think we need to kind of dig into, but it creates a dilemma for Chester Nimitz, which is what to do about it. I mean, it's great to have the information. I'm delighted to know all this, Nimitz kind of says to himself, but what am I going to do about it? I mean, Midway Atoll is a tiny little speck of mostly dry land, these 2 little islands around an atoll. It's got 1 airfield, as we saw in the overhead photograph there, but it's really not that absolutely decisive to America. The Japanese goal is to lure the American carriers out. But one option for Nimitz clearly is to say, I'm not going to take that bait. I've only got 3 carriers. The Saratoga is back undergoing repairs in Bremerton. I've got 3 carriers, one of whom is crippled and limping back from the Coral Sea. I've really only got 2 fully operationally capable carriers. Am I really going to risk that against an overwhelming force that's going after this little island, especially since the Japanese are going to have a really hard time hanging on to Midway, even if they take it. I mean, it's 2,500 miles from Tokyo. The Japanese problem is their maritime supply lines anyway. Are they really going to bring everything they need to sustain a Japanese occupation force on Midway? The American submarines would rip it to pieces. So clearly one option is to say, okay, take it. Now let's see if you can keep it. So the first issue for Nimitz is he going to respond to this challenge? And he decides that he is. And I think it's easy to underestimate how bold a decision that was. He's not throwing the dice. He's not a gambler. He's worked this out carefully. One of his key phrases, and Trent knows this because we've talked about this, he uses the phrase calculated risk a lot. And he has conducted his operational decision-making so far on the basis of finally calculating how much risk to accept for how much benefit. So I think the first decision is to appreciate Nimitz's, I think, very bold decision that, well, yes, I've only got 2 fully operational carriers, but I can patch up the Yorktown, and Midway, kind of a carrier. It's got an airstrip on it. So he loads it up with as many airplanes as he can. And he says, all right, I've got 4 airplane platforms. They've got 4 airplane platforms. Let's go.
Trent, do you have a follow-up on that?
Sure. Yeah. I think Craig's got an excellent point that Nimitz is thinking about options. What can I do? And if you look at where Point Luck is, I'm sure John will have more to say about this, but the initial positioning of the U.S. carriers involves an option, right? I don't think there's any question that Nimitz is going to try to prevent the Japanese from taking Midway. The question is, how much is he going to invest, right? What is the calculation of risk that he's willing to appreciate and to take? So, the submarines go up there, Midway gets packed full planes. Now, Nimitz has instructions from Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief, and one of the first things that King sends to Nimitz, even before Nimitz assumes command of the Pacific Fleet, is, look, you've got 2 things that you have to do. 1, hold Hawaii to Midway and its communications with the West Coast. 2, maintain communications with Australia. And those are the 2 things that John showed us in his preamble that the Japanese are interested in going after. Now, the other thing that Nimitz has is he's got a lot of pressure, right? From King, from Secretary Knox, Navy Secretary Knox, and through them, from the president, Franklin Roosevelt. Show some results. The Japanese have been running rampant in the Pacific. It's embarrassing for the U.S. Navy to an extent, the situation. And Nimitz isn't sure that he's going to have a job for very long if he can't deliver some kind of positive result. So if you look at his plans for Coral Sea, he's hoping to win some kind of victory over Japanese mobile forces. And in Midway, he's got an even better opportunity if things play out the way that he thinks they can. And so he sends the carriers up there. He commits to this idea even before he knows that Yorktown is going to be available.
Right.
And we'll just hold the carriers off to the side for a while until we see how things develop. Oh, things are developing the way we expected. We have the chance to trap these Japanese in an ambush. And at that point, I think that Nimitz's calculation shifts a bit. His aggressive disposition, which often isn't seen in a lot of the histories that we read, takes over. And he's not a gambler, no, but he knows that he's got a very high chance of a positive outcome, and he takes it. But all that context is important, right? The allies, the United States especially, need a victory in the Pacific. He's been told, hold Midway, and he goes for it.
So this one, John, in the Cliff's notes of the battle, we didn't give you a lot of time to go into it, but Trent actually brought this point up in our pre-webinar discussions. And Trent, please feel free to add on, as well as Craig. But can you talk about the relationship between the Japanese strike at Midway and their decision to attack the Aleutians?
Yeah, well, the Aleutians is an operation that's just kind of tacked on, frankly, into the operational plan. Really, what the Aleutians is the price that Yamamoto has to pay for his political victory. It was not part of his original operational vision, but he kind of pulls some skullduggery to get his way in that debate. And the result is that Tokyo says, okay, well, fine, you can go first. But while you're busy doing this, we want you to go grab the Aleutians because we have some army staffers over here who think that the Aleutians could eventually be used as bomber bases against northern Japan, which is ludicrous. If you've ever been to the Aleutians, the weather up there is just god awful. But nevertheless, that's the mission that is then given to Yamamoto, that, okay, while you're doing Midway, I want you to grab the Aleutians too. And it is to Yamamoto's discredit that he does not toe the line and say, I want all my carrier assets to do the things I want to do, and the Aleutians is irrelevant. But he doesn't. And that's an indication, I think, of A sense of complacency on the part of the Japanese, that they've been running roughshod over us for the last 6 months, and he feels that he's going to be able to take Midway without much problem, and the Aleutians will be sort of an expedient land grab, if you will, during the course of this, and it just shouldn't take that much extra effort.
Yeah, I think that's true. There are a couple of things about the Aleutian operation that are interesting. If you read some of the older histories, pre-John Parshall, of the Battle of Midway, you'll see a lot of people suggesting, well, this is supposed to be a diversion. Right. This is supposed to distract the Americans from the main effort. And so often historians, commentators on the battle tie them together in ways that they don't really belong to be tied together. The distances are too great. They take place too much simultaneously to be a diversion for Midway. And the other thing John just mentioned is this whole issue of victory disease. This is the idea that things have gone so well for the Japanese. Pearl Harbor ended up better than they thought it was. They assumed they'd lose 2 carriers in the attack on Pearl Harbor. They lost none. And of course, they've had this rampage down south. They've captured just about everything they want in the Dutch East Indies. So they're feeling like they can't lose. And I think that plays a factor, not only in going to the Aleutians, which is unnecessary to the main operation here entirely, but also it's what keeps the Shokaku out of the Kido Butai. They come with 4 carriers. They could have come with 5 if they had treated the Shokaku the way the Americans treated the Yorktown and patched it up and put together a new air group and sent it. They could have had 5 carriers. And if we're going to play what if, that changes the dynamic dramatically. So I think the victory disease on the part of the Japanese is a factor here.
Yeah, I would.
Sorry, Trent. Go
yeah,
ahead.
I mean, I'm not gonna. We call it victory disease, but I think that there's something more. There's something a little bit deeper at work. I mean, yes, the Japanese have a lot of confidence, but they are displaying in the run-up to Midway an inability to develop a coherent strategy. Right? There's 3 different things going on. One, there's like, let's extend in the South Pacific. Let's try to cut the line of communications between the American West Coast and Australia. That makes some strategic sense. But then there's Yamamoto's vision. Let's try to seek a decisive battle with the Pacific Fleet, and let's win it and try to knock the United States out of the war that way. Okay, there's some coherence to that, but they're trying both at the same time. And then in addition, let's seize some land in the Aleutians as a defensive strategy to prevent American bombers from being able to strike the home islands. And they try to do all 3 of these things at the same time. Yeah. And it's a dispersal of effort that does not serve them well. And I think that's crucial backdrop here to Midway. So it's not just we think we can do everything. I mean, maybe that's part of it, but it's an inability to say, what is it we really want to do? What is our theory of winning this war? And how do we bring our options together into something that is going to work for us, is going to give us the best result, given our resources and our capabilities. And they fail to do that. And it's really interesting to me that they do. I wish I knew more about it.
They don't have a coherent strategy for ending this war. It's funny, if you look at some of Yamamoto's remarks around this time, basically his strategy is, I'm just going to keep hitting these guys as hard and as fast as I can and hope that they fold. So you see this sort of substitution of operations for real strategy. It's just like they don't have a strategy.
And we are going to dabble in some what ifs, but since we're on it, what if there was no Aleutian diversion, no distraction? What if Yamamoto was able to just focus on Midway? What if the Japanese were able to scrap that 5th carrier together? I know those are both big questions and unanswerable, but let's see how we do with our first what if for the webinar.
Well, I will say that from an operational precedent, the carrier force that's up in the Aleutians doesn't have any precedent of actually operating with Nagumo's carrier force, because they are a slower set of carriers. So I don't really know that he would have brought them along to the party. Zuikaku is the real wild card in this mix. Zuikaku doesn't get scratched down at the Battle of Coral Sea, which is a month prior, early May. The Japanese could have scraped together some sort of a composite air group for her and probably brought her along with 59 aircraft And that would have made, I think, a measurable difference in terms of at least the overhead cover that they can provide for their force. But as you say, they just weren't really as motivated to do that. They thought that 4 carriers was going to be fine because they only felt that there were going to be 2 American carriers that could possibly oppose them. They thought
John's provided the museum with a wonderful recap of for the 80th anniversary of Coral Sea. I invite all of you who are viewing this to check it out in the comments and on the museum's The War tab, where we have all of our historical essays. Craig, in answer to the American motivation question, you had brought up intelligence and what does Nimitz do with us? I'd like us to talk about Station Hypo, Joe Rochefort. How important was this intelligence work, and how sure of a bet was AF? You know, we all know the AF code, but who was the intended audience of AF? Was it to convince Nimitz that he was right? Was it to trap the Japanese, or could you tell us, please?
Yeah, I'll start with that. I think there's a couple of things we need to appreciate about the decryption that's so much a part of both the Coral Sea and Midway. And that is, yes, it was extraordinarily important. But let me also put a little kind of footnote to that by saying, when the information became public in the 1970s of how much of a role Hypo played in the Battle of Midway in particular, but also in the Coral Sea, there was a tendency to go overboard in saying, oh, well, no wonder we won. We knew everything. We had a copy of their plans. We were reading their mail, and none of that is true. I think it's important to recognize that this team down in the basement of the Naval District Headquarters building with those primitive IBM machines, spending 20 hours a day in some cases trying to winkle little tiny pieces of information out of this Japanese code system. When we say we broke their code, what we mean is we were able to get glimpses, pieces, sections of the messages that we pulled out of the ether. And then it was up to Rochefort and his team to try to decide what that meant. And the dilemma for Rochefort is he doesn't work for Nimitz. He works for Joe Redmond at Op-20G in Washington, D.C. But he and Layton, Eddie Layton, who was Nimitz's intelligence officers, were buddies. They had spent 3 years together in Japan. They knew each other. They were on a secure phone line back and forth. So Rochefort would short circuit the system. He would send his, not only the raw information, but his take on it to Layton, who took it to Nimitz. And Nimitz learned to trust it, not just at the Coral Sea, but even before that during Halsey's first foray into the Marshall Islands. And having developed that sense of trust, it's what helped Nimitz make the decision to pick up the gauntlet thrown by the Japanese. So it's very important, but it's not so important that it explains, well, of course we won, we read their plans. That's going too far. And I think it's important to appreciate that. And I'll let Trent talk some more about this if he wants to.
Well, you're absolutely right, Craig. There's this fragments, right? And it has to be pieced together, not just the code breaking, but also intercepted traffic. You know, it's just, you know, Akagi, right? It's Akagi who has a very distinctive message handler, you know, the way his hand would hit the cue. One of the things that I think is really important here to know about the history of the code breaking is how far back some of it goes. So one of the things that really struck me and helps explain how receptive Nimitz was to the information that was emerging from Station Hypo through Layton is that in 1934, the US Asiatic Fleet is spying, you know, keeping tabs on a Japanese operational exercise. They put together an order of battle. They track the movements of the Japanese ships because they're breaking the codes. The Japanese codes at that time, you know, 8 years before, are much simpler. They're easier to crack, but it's being done primarily on the flagship of the Asiatic Fleet, the cruiser Augusta, and Nimitz is captain of Augusta at that time. So he has a history and a knowledge of the kind of insight that this intelligence can give. And so when Hypo and Rochefort emerge as a group that can begin to give him this kind of insight, he's very receptive to it. How can I use this as an advantage? How can I capitalize on this? And you asked Jeremy about AF. Hypo knew or had very high confidence that AF was Midway as early as March 1942, because there had been sufficient traffic to suggest that was the case. And then they got another message about AF that suggested there was some kind of an impending strike. And very soon after that, 2 long-range Japanese seaplanes approach Midway. One of them drops away, but the other one keeps coming. And so after that, Rochefort is like, AF is Midway. That just is what it is. Now, before Midway, though, before the battle, the challenge is, where's the blow going to fall? Because Rochefort and Hypo, Leighton, they become aware that the Japanese are going to conduct some kind of serious offensive. And they know this is going to happen in early May. So May 6th is the first intelligence briefing that I think it appears in. But where? Where are they going to strike? They're not sure. And then on the 13th of May, there's the famous message from the Japanese transport that is going to bring supplies to AF for this new offensive. And so, you know, Rochefort and Leighton link these two together. Leighton talks to Nimitz. Nimitz sends his chief of the war plan section, an officer named Lynn McCormick, to Hypo, basically to sit down with Rochefort and gauge how accurate is this intelligence? Can I rely on it? Can the boss bank on this? McCormick is convinced, Nimitz is convinced, and that's when the wheels get put into motion. And I think you're asking about the AF, about the water message, and that comes later. And that is not to justify in Nimitz's mind if Midway is the target. That's to make it very plain for other observers who are apprehensive about the way that Nimitz is starting to gamble.
Mostly in Washington.
And you can imagine why that's the case, because King in Washington, and of course to a certain extent Secretary Knox, but King in particular, and OP-20G, these people who are supposed to be responsible for the overall accumulation of enemy intelligence, they're saying, well, yeah, it could be Midway, but there are so many other possible targets. It could even be the west coast of the United States. It could be the Panama Canal. It could be Samoa. It could be Noumea. It could, how do you know? How are you sure? And that's what leads Rochefort, actually Jasper Holmes, who was on his staff, who had been an engineering officer, is the guy who comes up with the idea. I know how we can prove to them that we're right. And that is to say, we'll send a message through submarine cable, which is secure, out to Midway. They will send one in the ether through the air, a radio message saying our saltwater evaporators have broken down, and we're short of water, and then wait. And sure enough, here comes a Japanese message saying AF is short of water. Well, there you go, smoking gun. And Rochefort didn't even report that. He just let it sit out there and let Washington find it and say, oh, I see, it is Midway. You're right. He knew all along. Nimitz was 99% sure too, but they had to prove it to Washington.
John, can you talk about the Japanese communications security? What were they doing? Were they just loose lips sink ships?
No,
quite literally here?
The bottom line is that the Japanese code system was extremely sophisticated and relatively secure. It is true that the Japanese have a certain degree of, I don't know, smugness around the difficulties associated with their language, and don't think that people can, other than Japanese, can really speak it too terribly well. But that said, I think they were within their rights to think that their system was relatively secure. What that points to is the brilliance of our cryptographers.
Thank you. Trent, we've talked about this, the calculated risk. We've talked about the work to get Yorktown ready, and the Japanese not doing that for their fifth carrier. How crucial was Yorktown's availability in Nimitz's mind that this was something he was up to the task for, that not getting the Yorktown there, but that they could confront the Japanese at Midway because the Yorktown would be ready, operational?
I think this is another reason why the initial positioning of Point Luck, which again is something that John noticed, is so important, because in an estimate before the battle, it's clear that Nimitz and his staff think, well, we should position ourselves even if Yorktown isn't available. We should put the other two carriers out there. We should prepare for this. And I don't think York,
I was
go
gonna say,
ahead.
can I go ahead and just share a graphic here? I've actually pre-positioned the slide so that you can talk about this. But here is the initial placement of Point Luck, which is well away from Midway itself and is about 360 nautical miles away from where the Japanese are supposed to be showing up. Take it away, Trent.
Yeah. So the initial positioning here is outside of strike range. Right. So even if Yorktown isn't available, Nimitz can send out the two other carriers and they could sit there. And then depending on how things develop, John alluded to the concept, well, maybe the submarines get into it. Maybe they mix it up. Maybe Midway's strike forces, their planes have some success. And if so, then the carriers could come in and clean up. Right, because the Japanese may not be aware that they're there. There could be a surprise. So Nimitz is preserving options. I mean, as the battle plays out, Yorktown is crucial. That extra flight deck is extremely important, especially to knock out the last of the Japanese carriers. But he's thinking about doing this even with just two. But he's thinking about doing it in a way that preserves his options and doesn't commit those two carriers to a battle at really negative or unfortunate odds. And so I think that's interesting here. You have to think about the stages to it. You have to think about the points of commitment and the different options that Nimitz preserves along the way. So getting Yorktown ready is great, yes, but hey, the Japanese are coming and we should be prepared to take advantage of any opportunities that emerge, even if she can't go. But as you saw in John's preamble, right, the strike groups from Yorktown, they have a 3, and Yorktown's carrier number 5. 3 is Saratoga. So those are Saratoga's planes.
Yeah.
And I think that's really key also, is the flexibility that's inherent in the way that the U.S. Navy has structured its carrier air groups and its ability to shift them from flight deck to flight deck.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, John.
I was just going to say, there's an article coming out in the Naval War College Review, I hope any day now, by myself, talking about Point Luck. And I don't think that we've really appreciated its importance in the battle up until this point. With that distant placement of those carriers away from the anticipated point of action, the net result is that our carriers cannot engage in battle probably on the first day of that encounter. So think about that. I mean, that's giving the commanders on the spot the option to say, to kind of sit back and see how things are going. And if things are going badly, they can disengage cleanly and get out of Dodge without ever being brought to battle or even sighted by the Japanese. What ends up happening is on June 2nd, 2 crucial things occur. First, Yorktown arrives at Point Luck. And so now Nimitz knows I've got not 2, but 3 carriers on station. The second thing that happens is that Hypo is telling him 100% Zuikaku is not coming to the party. So the result of that is that now Nimitz feels comfortable ratcheting up the percentage of risk. And what you see occurring then is that he moves his carriers further to the west. And so whereas they were 350, 360 miles away from when the Japanese were going to show up, if you look now at their position on the morning of 4 June, they're within about 200, 225 miles of where the Japanese are supposed to be. That means that now they can engage in combat on the first day, the morning of the first day. That's a big change.
John, there's one other crucial thing that happens, which is that the battle, the sighting of Japanese forces conforms to what Hypo's intelligence had been telling Nimitz was going to happen.
Yes.
So now he's got real confidence that this is going to start to play out the way that he was anticipating. So I think that's another crucial piece of why he instructs Fletcher and the carriers to move west.
Yep.
Craig, there's lots of components to this, but if you could sum it up to one crucial decision made by Nimitz, made by Hypo, made by DC, made by anybody, what do you think was the one decision that influenced the outcome of the Battle of Midway?
That is such a mean question, Jeremy, because as we all know, there are so many of them. And if I have to pick one, It's the one I mentioned at the outset, which is Nimitz's decision. I'm going to pick up the gauntlet. I'm going to send my 2 carriers out there. Maybe I'm going to send my 3 carriers out there. And we're going to kind of, I think Trent and John are absolutely right here. We're going to kind of wait and see how this goes. The last conversation Nimitz has with Spruance is, I don't want it to be a slugfest. Don't go in there and take them on all out. This is what kind of attrition can you apply? And if things aren't working out, head west, get beyond their range, get out, save the carriers. They have to be saved at any cost. So he's playing the odds a little bit here, and he's being nuanced in his decision making. So, but I do think that Nimitz's decision to take this on in the first place is the most important American decision. Now, beyond that, there are cascading number. There's McCluskey's decision to turn north. There's Dick Best's decision to break off and head for the Akagi. I mean, there are so many of these. And on the Japanese side, I would say it's Nagumo's critical decision when he finds out, yes, there's an American carrier out there to the northeast of him, and his planes are coming back from the attack on Midway, and his cap has to be rotated, and what's he going to do? And he decides to bring everything in, send them down to the hangar deck, rearm, refuel, get ready, and send everything off together instead of sending the 36 planes he's got ready to go on the Hiryu, which he could have done, but it would have been a violation of Japanese doctrine, and decides not to do it. So that's the critical Japanese decision, I think, on that side. And that for me, it's still Nimitz on the American side. But
John,
let me give a
let's
shout
go-
out to Dick Best there too for his
Well,
decision.
that's my number one. I'm, Dick Best having the perceptiveness to realize that his own attack on Kaga has been spoiled, to realize that Akagi is getting off scot-free, to hustle over there with 3 airplanes, attack that ship and put it out of business. That's hair-raising, because if Akagi makes it through this attack at 10:20, her torpedo plane squadron gets added into the mix.
Yep.
That squadron is commanded by Lieutenant Murata Shigeharu, who is the leading torpedo warfare expert in the Japanese Navy. God help the Yorktown if this combined group of torpedo planes and dive bombers hits her. At that point, it's a crapshoot. So,
I can't resist mentioning that I met Dick Best. I don't
Did
know
you?
if either of you have had that great opportunity.
I almost did.
Yeah, he came to the Naval Academy when we dedicated the Midway Monument out there in front of Bancroft Hall, and he's just standing there looking modest and quiet, not like the wild-haired fellow that we see in the Midway film at all. And I got to say, thank you and shake his hand, and that was kind of a neat moment for me.
Yeah.
Trent, what's your take on this, sir?
Well, I think it is less, it's less in the heat of the moment. But I think the crucial decision is on the American side is once Yorktown's damage is discovered, to just say, we are going to, turn this around in, I forget exactly how many hours it is, right? But, as fast as possible and get that ship ready to fight. It's not going to be 100%, but we're going to do it. Because I think in the end that having that third flight deck makes an immense amount of difference on the US side. And so, it could have just been, well, Yorktown is damaged, she needs to go to Bremerton. We're going to send her to the West Coast. She'll get repaired, get full. But no, it's let's figure out, let's apply, ingenuity and creativity and work our tails off to get this ship in position to make the difference. And I think that that's a really important commitment and decision on the US Navy side.
Yeah, we're going to shift now to sort of the legacy portion of this discussion, talking about the immediate legacy. John, was the weight of this battle felt by the Japanese? Well, not just before, but the losses. Were they realistic with how damaging this was? Did this affect what we had discussed earlier, their quote victory disease? Can you tell us how this was felt in Tokyo and beyond?
It's weird. Throughout the war, the Japanese subscribed to this notion that there would be some sort of a decisive battle, and the winner of that battle is going to go on to victory, and the loser needs to get to the negotiating table as a result of that loss. And yet every one of those decisive battles turned out to be a defeat for the Japanese, and they never were inclined to come to the negotiating table. Okay, so apparently decisive failures only apply to the enemy. They don't really apply to us. There certainly was a recognition in Tokyo that the loss of 4 aircraft carriers was absolutely devastating, and that this loss could not be made good in the near term or even in the midterm. But it didn't really end up checking the aggressiveness of the Japanese towards their subsequent war operations. For instance, you look at their ground operations in New Guinea, which kick off a month afterwards with an overland attack aimed at Port Moresby. It really is the Battle of Coral Sea, the sequel, except it's being done on land as opposed to being done at sea. And so, they were still in an offensive character when you could argue that they really needed to be shifting over to the defensive. The other thing that plays against them is that in the carrier battles off of Guadalcanal, they convince themselves that they are doing much better in those battles than they actually do. And so this is the beginning of a really vicious cycle of Japanese self-disinformation, that they are continually convinced that they're sinking 3-4 American carriers at a pop. And so, why wouldn't we keep going when we're doing as well as we think we are? They weren't, but that they didn't know that.
Craig, can you talk about?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please speak to the American reaction, the immediate reaction to the battle, and was the gravity of this situation felt?
Let me just follow up on John's. I think one of the things about, lying to yourself is an interesting component part of the Japanese attitude in this whole war, but also lying to their own people. I mean, the Japanese newspapers, correct me if I'm wrong, John, the Japanese newspapers presented this as another great victory, banzai, we've won this battle. And so they're lying to their public, but they're also kind of lying to themselves a little bit. And it's just like, I don't want to make too many modern analogies, but if you're inside Russia, well, the Russian army's doing just great in Ukraine, that kind of stuff. All right, the American side, I think immediately there was Spruance was just excited. He sent a message to Nimitz saying, all 4 Japanese carriers heavily damaged. Well, that wasn't quite true. It was 3 of the 4. They got the 4th later in the afternoon. And even then, they didn't know that the 4th had been sunk. They knew it had been heavily damaged. It's not till the 19th of June, 15 days after the battle, when the submarine tender Ballard picks up a lifeboat full of Japanese who decided not to go down with the ship, that he finds out that the Hiryu has in fact gone down, and it's a clean sweep. All 4 carriers have gone down. And then there's this big argument about, well, what sunk them? Because the Army Air Force says, we did it with the B-17s. Here I was at 30,000 feet and I looked down and there were all these explosions and smoke. We must have sunk them. And that's what the newspaper headlines back in the States said. Army bombers ruined Jap fleet, says the headline. Well, that led to a lot of fistfights in the officers' club in the weeks to follow. So it takes a little while, I think, for the Americans to appreciate just how decisive this victory was at Midway. But as soon as that is appreciated, as John pointed out in his introduction, it led to, let's seize the offensive right away. Let's get into the Solomons and see what we can do there.
Trent, if you wouldn't mind, and also then blended over the greater lessons learned. You wrote your book on learning war. What were the lessons? What was the immediate reaction in your mind from the Americans? But what were the lessons learned that were quickly applied for the rest of 42, but all the way through 45?
Well, there's quite a few that come out from this pair of early carrier battles, and then some of them are refined in the later ones off Guadalcanal that John has alluded to. I mean, one of the ones that's easiest to recognize, right, comes from the demise of the torpedo bomber squadrons. The TBD Devastator is not suitable for modern combat in 1942, and it was on its way out anyway. But there's pressure to make sure that happens, and that happens quickly. Similarly, it's recognized that the PBY, the Catalina, can't really maintain its presence in the face of fighter opposition. right? It doesn't have the defensive firepower necessary. So Nimitz and others in the Navy begin to turn to Army aircraft. You know, the B-17 is suitable for that role, but ultimately the solution is a Navy version of the B-24, the privateer, which gives sterling service through the Pacific later in the war. The value of being able to be modular with carrier air wings, as you know, I talked about earlier with Yorktown, you know, she gets planes from Saratoga's air group. That is a large lesson that comes forth. Nimitz doubles down on that idea, says he's going to, you know, maintain a modular capacity to substitute planes and their air wings in and out of the flight decks. And that gives the U.S. Navy significant capability in that sense over the course of the war. Air defenses have to get better, right? There are improved fighter direction techniques that begin to emerge. The U.S. Navy already started putting more fighter aircraft on carriers by the time of Midway, but you know, over the course of the war, that's going to increase significantly further, partially to counter the emerging kamikaze threat in late 1944. But also, you know, air defense weapons have to get better. Right, the 1.1 inch cannon isn't very effective. It's going to be replaced more or less wholesale by the 40 millimeter Bofors, and those are just going to start appearing all over U.S. Navy ships. And the 5-inch gun has to be made more effective. They begin to invest in the proximity fuse, which is going to allow, you know, shells to explode when they are near an enemy aircraft, so you don't have to accurately guess its height or distance to get the fuse timing right on the 5-inch guns. So U.S. Navy carriers begin to develop a capability to defend themselves. That is really transformational by the time late 1943, early 1944 comes around, and you can see that in carrier battles off Rabaul in late 1943, and then especially Philippine Sea. It really transforms things. Another thing that's important, but not commented on as much, is the need to make sure that there's a unified command of land-based air forces. So, you know, the ComAir SOPAC, you know, commanding Air Forces South Pacific that John McCain slides into as part of the Guadalcanal fight, that is a lesson from Coral Sea and Midway. And then we talked about hypo earlier, but there's a need to better do intelligence, to, you know, consolidate it and create a better organization for gathering, disseminating, analyzing, and providing the Pacific Fleet with up-to-date intelligence information. So a intelligence center at Pearl Harbor, ICPOA, Intelligence Center Pacific Operating Areas, is established on the 25th of June, 1942, and that begins to fill the role that hypo had before Midway. And then there are also some shuttling around of officers post Midway, like Pai, Vice Admiral Pai, who was in command of the Pacific Fleet's battleships. He is removed. He didn't perform particularly well, at least based on the assessments of Nimitz's staff. You know, took the battleships out from the West Coast in a way that was kind of wasteful. And the amphibious force commander, Vice Admiral Wilson Brown, is also seen as someone who's not really suitable for the emerging conflict in the Pacific.
Hey, Craig, on that, your book subtitled "Command Leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay" about Admiral Nimitz. Please feel free to add your own to Trent's robust laundry list of lessons learned there, but also focus on Nimitz and what did he take away as a leader, as a commander, for how he was going to conduct and ultimately be victorious in this war.
Yeah, that's great. I think what Trent was touching on there at the end was really central to Nimitz's reconsideration of what this meant for him. Nimitz was a people person. He was able to manage the people that managed the war. And he had to have the right people in the right place. He had already decided before this that he wanted Ray Spruance as his own chief of staff. So Ray Spruance, even though he performed, I think brilliantly is not an overstatement, in the Battle of Midway, comes ashore to be chief of staff. And the problematic one he's got is Mark Mitcher. Now, I don't know how much we're going to do about the flight to nowhere, but you got the whole thing about Pete Mitcher sending his air group off in the wrong direction and then lying about it afterward. I know that's a confrontational word. I'm going to use it anyway. Lying about it afterward for a variety of reasons that we can discuss if it comes to that. But Nimitz had to do something about this. And initially he had pegged, in fact, he had announced on June the 16th, orders that would make him a task group commander, and those are withdrawn 3 days later, and Mitscher goes off to become the PBY squadron commander at Kaneohes. Well, that's not a step up, by the way, for him, and Mitscher kind of knew he had been shelved. Nimitz keeps this quiet, but he finds the right guys to take the right jobs. And that's what Nimitz does so brilliantly. He does it subtly. He does it without ruining careers if he can, but he moves those chess pieces about on the board to have the right people with the right temperament in the right place to get the job done. And I think he learns a lot about those people from the Battle of Midway and then makes his decisions based on that.
I'm just going to jump in here since we sort of glossed over the goats section. But Trent and I go back and forth on Mark Mitscher. I say in this article that is just about to come out from the Naval War College Review, Mark Mitscher sank the Yorktown. Okay. And that's a horrible thing to say. But the bottom line is that if Mitscher's air group had not gone off on the flight to nowhere, the odds are that it would have found Kita Butai at around 9:20, 9:30 in the morning. Odds are it should have knocked out a couple of those carriers and left the remains to be picked up by Enterprise in Yorktown an hour later. The Americans could easily have won this battle 4-zip by lunchtime, and then there would have been no counterattack against Yorktown. There wouldn't have been anything, left to talk about at that point. So the fact that Mitscher mishandled his air group as awfully as he did is directly culpable for the loss of the Yorktown. Go at me, Trent. You know you want to.
A little bit, yeah, because we talked about the flight to nowhere. Yeah, but why? Why does Mitscher think that it makes sense to send his air group where he sends it? And so what we haven't mentioned is in the operational plan, there is a suggestion that maybe the Japanese are going to operate their carriers in two groups. Yes. Maybe one is going to close midway and the other one is going to provide more distant cover. And so Mitscher is, I think, planning as if that were true, right? So he's like, okay, we've spotted one group of carriers. It's only known based on what's been reported, if I remember right, that there are 2 Japanese carriers in that group. So, he's hearing there's 4 Japanese carriers coming to the battle. 2 have been sighted. Where's the other 2? And I think he has also got a mindset. I could be totally wrong about this, but I think he's thinking, there are a bunch of black shoes, surface warfare officers in charge of this. I, being, a carrier officer, I have to prove that we are competent and capable, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to take the burden of the whole brown shoe community on my shoulders, and I'm going to show them how it's done. And we're going to send our planes out to that spot. We're going to find those other 2 carriers, and we're going to win the battle by lunchtime. That's what he's trying to do, but he gets it wrong.
Yeah,
he gets it wrong. So,
and I would give him that slack if he had cleared that with his superior officer before he did it.
Yeah, that is the big problem. And I think Craig is absolutely right. Nimitz is a people person. Nimitz is good at this. And I think to an extent, Nimitz is not happy with this, but he finds,
I think that's an understatement.
Yeah, but he finds a way for Mitscher to redeem himself, right? So he goes down into the Solomons and he's commanding, air in the Solomons, and he's there when the flight that shoots down Admiral Yamamoto's plane. Yep. He's part of that decision loop. And then he does a very good job with the fast carrier task forces starting in early 1944. So Mitscher's got capabilities. He's got
no doubt about it. I'm not trying to demean his capabilities at all. And I think it's instructive that Nimitz, in a way, kept going back to Spruance and saying, well, do you think it's time for Mitscher to get a second chance? And Spruance says, no, I don't want that guy to have a second chance. And when Spruance takes over the 5th Fleet, the big blue fleet for the Central Pacific Drive, Nimitz goes to him and says, hey, what about Mitscher as your carrier man? Nope, don't want him. And finally, Nimitz just does it anyway. So the guy who really wants to keep Mitscher on the shelf indefinitely is Ray Spruance. And Nimitz does give him that second chance. And of course, Mitscher, being Mitscher, seizes it with both hands and becomes, as his biographer called him, the magnificent Mitscher in 1944.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to take it out of the Pacific and go to the home front. Talk about the American public, and they probably got news reports. They also, we have the famous John Ford film, Battle of Midway. Can you talk about the effect of the victory at Midway, what it had on American morale, and was John Ford's film the first step to making Midway what it is today, this monumental battle?
Who's going to take this? Come on.
Don't all jump in at once.
I do have something to actually say on this topic. I don't think that film had as dramatic an effect on American morale as you might think. I think that the year was not going well. And just because we have managed to, fend the Japanese off from one attack, yes, that was a good thing. But this is something that my friend Richard Frank pointed out to me a number of years ago, was that there was an editorial run in the New York Times in July. So this is a month after the news is now fully in the hands of the American population that we have won this great victory. And yet the New York Times, which was a very friendly paper to FDR's administration, ran an editorial that said, the war is not going well. And the war, not only that, is so big and complex that it is beyond the capabilities of FDR to effectively manage this war, and he needs to appoint a supreme commander-in-chief to a military man to run this effort. So that tells you something about what the mood in the general population was like. Because of course, there's all sorts of other stuff going on, not just in the Pacific. Things are going badly for Russia. Things are going very badly in the Middle East for the Brits. It's a mess. And one victory, even as dramatic as Midway was, does not necessarily settle everybody down to suddenly think, oh, we're going to win this war. It was not at all obvious.
Craig or Trent?
Well, I'll say this about John Ford. I mean, John Ford was on Midway Island when the Japanese attacked it. And of course, what a great opportunity for a filmmaker, right? And he climbs up onto this high point and he's got his cameraman with him. And he's saying, look, get those, look over there. I mean, he's exposed himself and he's ordered, get down, get into cover. No, I've got to get these pictures. So what he shows to the American viewing public is the Japanese bombing of Midway Island. He can't get out to the place where the battle is fought. I remember when I was working on my book on Midway, I kept getting the question, are you going to go out and visit the battlefield? Well, now, wait a minute. Back in the day when I was a Civil War historian, you could visit Gettysburg and get a sense of what was going on. But you know what's at the battle where the Battle of Midway was fought? It's ocean. And John Ford never got out there. He didn't see the dive bomber attack on the Kido Butai. He didn't see ships going down. What he had was lots of footage of Japanese planes bombing Midway Island. So he used it. But I don't think, as John says, it had that much of an effect. I do think that there was a strong sense that the Navy had won a big victory. And I do think the public understood that this was a big victory. If you talk about newspapers, I suppose we could go into the fact that the Seligman for the Chicago Tribune published that article on the front page. We knew they were coming because we broke their code. Right. Holy mackerel. Ernie King wanted to arrest him and have him shot. Yeah. But Cooler had said, if you do that, the Japanese are going to know that he was right. So don't say anything. But I think there was a strong sense among the American public that, yes, this was big. More so, I think, than John has suggested here. You want to argue about that, John? No?
Trent, do you want to be the tiebreaker here?
I don't think there's a whole lot that I could add. I mean, I do think that the John Ford, from my perspective, the John Ford film is fascinating. But Craig's right. I mean, it's a footage of the attack on Midway, and there's a line in it that I'm never going to forget. It's there's a shot of Goonie birds on the island.
Yeah.
And, the narration comes in, it's like, these are the inhabitants of Midway. Tojo has vowed to liberate them. And it's just this swipe that is, characteristically American, I think. And so that's amusing. But yeah, there's not, the drama that we can get when we read histories now, or even some that are older, that are, less accurate, but, well written, that's not in the film. None of that comes through. And so something is happening, but just because you've got the Midway footage, it's like, well, yeah, okay, the Japanese came and they bombed us. How did we win?
Trent makes a good point here. The film, the raw footage of combat that has the biggest impact on the American public is the footage that comes out of Tarawa. That has an impact. The people see Marines floating in the body and floating in the ocean, Marine bodies dead on the beach, piled up dead bodies, and lots of it is in color. And that really has an impact, much more so than anything John Ford ever did.
I was just going to pipe in that, unfortunately, one of the losses at Midway, we might have had that footage because there was a Japanese cameraman on the Akagi, a guy by the name of Makishima, who had a camera on the deck of Akagi and filmed the dive bomber attack.
Wow.
So you think about a guy like me, I would give my eye teeth to see that footage, but unfortunately it went down with Akagi.
Yeah.
So, you can think about what ifs, what if we had been able to make that footage up with John Ford's footage, we actually would have seen what the battlefield actually looked like. Yeah. So
one of the things we'll be doing is in the comments section, we'll be linking to our Midway topics page, which includes a oral history interview and some footage from Bill Roy, who was on board the Yorktown. So check that out when you're done watching this wonderful conversation. We're not at the end yet, but we're approaching it. So we're going to do a quick rapid fire of the round table. It's easier to go into the negative, but it also takes up a lot more time. I'd like to stay on film, but follow up with books. Obviously, the three panelists here have great titles to the World War II, but Midway specific library. Are there others that you would recommend, both a film or documentary and another nonfiction work? We'll start with Craig, go to John, and then Trent.
Well, clearly, the book that John wrote with Anthony Tully about Shattered Sword, you're never going to surpass that in terms of the Japanese perspective. I learned a lot from that book about how the Japanese got to this position, the specifics of their hardware, things I did not know, and you can't find anyplace else. So Shattered Sword on the Japanese side. I'm immodest enough to suggest that my book, The Battle of Midway, says a lot about the American side. So there you go. And of course, Trent's book, which is coming out in September, is going to give us the overall architecture of decision-making, strategic planning embedded around the Battle of Midway, and for that matter, the entire Pacific War. So there's the three you put on the screen. And I know that sounds like I'm just saying, well, it's us, of course, but it kind of is. But I will also say this about movies. The earlier movies, the Charlton Heston film, I'm not a fan of. The new one, I kind of like it. When I heard Woody Harrelson was going to be Nimitz, I thought, oh no, but he's pretty convincing as Nimitz, and they have some bits in there that I think are quite good. There are mistakes, and I could be a nitpicker and say, hey, this is wrong and this is wrong. But generally speaking, if you want the kind of the film version of what John gave us at the beginning of this podcast, that's a pretty good movie, in my opinion. I don't know about you guys.
I actually will broadly second that. One of the biggest rocks that Tony and I were rolling up the hill, when we came out with Shattered Sword, was trying to dispute this notion that the Japanese flight decks were chock-a-block with airplanes that were ready to take off at the time of the American dive bomber attack. And God bless the 2019 film, there were no flight deck aircraft on the flight decks. And so that was a win from my perspective. Were there inaccuracies in that film? Oh my God, yes. But broadly speaking, it was a better effort than the 1976. And I concur. I thought that Woody Harrelson actually did a very credible Nimitz. I hated the Dick Best that they had.
Yeah, that was not him. I don't know who that guy was. That was Maverick. That's who that was.
Exactly. And Dick Best was like the most buttoned down professional, naval aviator you could lay your hands on. In terms of books, yeah, okay, Shattered Sword did a good job from the Japanese side, but machine translation is finally getting to the point where we can get our hands on better contemporary Japanese works. We can't translate Senshi Sosho, which is the official war history series yet. It's in an old style Japanese, and just you try feeding it into, you know, Google Translate and it just barfs. But there are other contemporary works in modern Japanese on the Battle of Midway, which I would love to have hands-on and translations, because I'm sure that there is stuff on the Japanese side that the Japanese know about that we don't. That's what I want.
I am disappointed in the Midway films that have come out so far. I mean, yeah, there are good points about the 2019 film, and I'll agree with the others that Woody Harrelson does a fine job. I liked his portrayal of Nimitz. I didn't like the way that his part was set. I would have loved to have seen a more accurate depiction of the situation map, the plot that Nimitz used, the one that was supposedly on sawhorses, rather than that, you know, sort of fine table that they had crafted in the film. So that would have been nice, but yeah, I don't think it's been done. I mean, there is enough drama in the battle. You don't have to add a whole lot to it. It would make a dramatic movie. Just sort of let's take, you know, what John has written. Let's take what Craig has written, turn that into a film, and bang. I think it'd be fantastic.
The 2019 film, for all intents and purposes, is looking at the USS Enterprise and its role in that battle. They don't talk about Hornet. They don't talk about Yorktown. There's none of those characters. And you can understand why, from a cinematographer standpoint, you know, there's too many characters for an audience to really keep their heads around in the course of a 2-hour film. But nevertheless, from a nerd perspective, yeah, it was not as encompassing as it needed to be.
As a filmmaker, you've got to choose particular people to wrap your movie around. They chose Nimitz. They chose Leighton, who gets, obviously they used his memoir for this because he looms very large in this film. And they chose Dick Best. And, you know, I'm trying to think, all right, who would I choose instead of those three? If I could only have three, that's not too bad.
Right.
Fletcher.
Yeah, I agree. Fletcher is much underrated. People don't even know that Fletcher was the operational commander. He was the senior officer president of float, the SOPA, right up until the moment he turns command over to Spruance when the Yorktown is in extremis. And people don't even know that Fletcher was the commanding officer at Midway. They think Spruance was. Well, he ended up being at the end, but not for most of it.
Yep.
You're right. Thank you, Trent. That's a good fix.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, on that one. I will say that my 8-year-old son loved playing with a B-17 and a P-51 until we watched the 2019 film, and then he wanted a toy SBD Dauntless. So it was a gateway for him. We're going to get into the close here, the fun part, because nobody can be right and nobody can be wrong. A couple of what ifs. John, let's start with you, but then play with Craig and Trent's answers. What if the Japanese had been successful and had captured Midway?
I don't really think it does them any good. I think that that Nimitz's calculation, frankly, mirrored the same calculation that the naval staff in Tokyo raised when they were objecting to Yamamoto's plan as well. Great, you've just grabbed this postage stamp sized atoll. We can't keep it in supply. The waters are alive with American submarines. It is not close enough to Oahu to really offer any sort of a fleet anchorage or even a large enough airfield to operate as a forward staging base to help us capture Oahu. It's nonsense. So yeah, I don't really think that it would have done them that much good. It represented a further extension of their defensive perimeter for very little in the way of tangible gains. There were certainly no economic gains to be had with Midway. I just think it's a cockamamie exercise.
Trent and then Craig, what if, how would Nimitz, did he have a contingency plan if Midway was captured?
Oh yeah, definitely. The amphibious force, the Pacific Fleet's amphibious force on the West Coast is on I forget exactly how many hours, but very quick alert. So Nimitz was prepared to recapture the island if the Japanese managed to take it. Obviously, he did not want them to take it. He was determined to prevent that from happening. But if it did happen, he wanted to take it back. And so I think one of the things that might happen is you get an early chance for the Marines, the U.S. Marines, to employ their amphibious assault doctrine. And we see how it goes against whoever the Japanese choose to position on the island and however many of them are left. Now, also, there's a big theory about, or big question about what happens to the naval forces? How long can the Japanese linger? Yamamoto wants to trigger this decisive battle. Nimitz wants to avoid it. He's not going to just play into Yamamoto's hands. He wants to recapture Midway. So how does that all play out? I'm not sure. But as Craig was saying earlier, I think there's going to be a lot of calculus around that to try to maximize the opportunities that the Pacific Fleet has and minimize the ensuing losses.
Yeah, I don't see an immediate counter attack on the part of the Americans. It's the kind of thing you do next month, because the bottom line is the Japanese logistics are very, very tenuous. There's no way that they can keep Kitabutai, just loitering off of Midway, waiting for this battle to shape up. It's got to happen within about a week's time, or they have to go home.
Craig.
Yeah, well, let me follow up on that. I think those are very good points. I think one of the things everybody watching this needs to remember is that Midway was not really the objective for Yamamoto. It's the bait. By attacking something valuable enough for the Americans to respond to, he wants to lure the remaining carriers. He thinks there's only 2 of them. He wants to lure them out into deep water where his 4 carriers can jump on them, send them to the bottom, and then he commands the Western Pacific all the way from the Hawaiian Islands to the shores of Japan. That's the objective. That's why he tells Nagumo, keep half of your planes back, because if you sight any of those carriers, that's your principal target. The idea was that you would attack Midway, the Americans would send out their carriers from Hawaii, and then you pounce on them. But of course, what he didn't know is that thanks to Hypo, those American carriers had long left Oahu and were in fact to the northeast of him, in literally the last place that they looked for them. So the objective being those carriers. What happens to Midway? That's kind of secondary. But I agree that by and large, if the Japanese take Midway, it does them no good whatsoever. And in fact, in those instructions, the verbal instructions that Spruance later remembered in an interview he did for Paris Match, Nimitz saying to him just before he left for Point Luck is that, listen, if we're gonna take some losses here, don't worry about it. Let them have the island. We can always get that back because they can't keep it. Nimitz knew that, like Adak and Kiska, if you just leave the Japanese there for a month or so, they'll go, oh my God, what have we done? And get out, which is what they did. And that same thing probably would have happened to Midway. Atoll is not, I like the way, by the way, John pronounced Midway atoll. What atoll decided to go for that target? That's not really the objective. That's just out there as the bait.
John, the next one start with you. What if this was a draw? How does the outcome of the Pacific War, at least in the 3 to 6 months after, if all 4 and all 3 carriers are lost on both sides?
That's a really interesting question, and I don't know. I think you can slice it both ways. Certainly in the long term, it does absolutely nothing for the Japanese other than potentially extend the war, because the American building programs are so extensive that we're going to be handed a writ of absolute naval insuperability sometime in 1944, and win or lose at Midway, nothing is going to affect that. I do think, obviously, if the Americans lose 3 carriers at Midway, though, you don't see the Guadalcanal campaign kicking off at the end of 1942. It's hard to anticipate how we would make that happen without any flight decks other than Saratoga. So, and WASP potentially in the mix as well. Anyway, yeah, I that's a hard one to answer. My crystal ball doesn't go that far. Anybody else want to?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and John, you're right about, like, the U.S. building programs are going to create this very large fleet, but that assumes that the decisive factor in the Pacific Wars is material. And I think that the Japanese were right, that it's not material. It's how long is the U.S. public willing to maintain the fighting, especially if Germany is defeated. And we can see this in the closing months of the Pacific War. It's becoming combined, with the Japanese effort to inflict as many casualties as possible. It's becoming difficult, right? There's pressure to bring the war to a close. Now, so if Guadalcanal doesn't happen, right now, and I'm uncertain about that, right? Because Ernie King, hey, I've got 2 carriers. Hey, I've got to preserve the supply line to Australia. Hey, I need to pull the Joint Chiefs of Staff along here and make sure that the Pacific doesn't get neglected, right? He's probably still thinking all those things.
Right.
So,
and the Japanese now only have, 3 carriers that are owned, 2 on 3. Yeah, it's good enough.
Yeah, maybe we could do it. Yeah. So, I mean, I think something happens in the South Pacific, whether it's Guadalcanal or not, I don't know. But then it probably doesn't, the U.S. offensive isn't going to be able to move as quickly. The kind of decisive defeat that happens off Guadalcanal through the campaign for the Japanese probably doesn't occur, or doesn't occur as quickly. And that means they can consolidate more. That means the war drags out. Does that mean it ends the way that it ends? If it drags into 1946, I'm doubtful of that.
I think you're right. I mean, among other things, if it drags into 1946, Hokkaido gets occupied by the Russians, and you've got a split Japan, among other things.
Yeah. So I think to me, that's the most interesting part of the what if, is what does it do to U.S. and Allied offensives that follow on after Midway.
Craig, what do you have to that, sir?
Well, I think Nimitz was absolutely sensitive to all of the points my 2 friends just made. And that's why he gave those instructions to Spruance. Hey, if it looks bad, if we cannot lose 2 of the 3 carriers, one's bad, losing 2, horrible, losing 3, Nimitz probably gets fired. So he tells Spruance, if that looks like that's a possibility, head west, get out of the way, save the carriers. So you're hypothetical that what if America loses all 3 carriers? I don't think that's anything that Nimitz would have tolerated or allowed to take place. If it does, if you're going to force me to say, then that's terrible for the United States. I think they probably lose Nimitz as commander, which I think is a bad thing. They probably lose Spruance as a fleet commander, which I think is a bad thing. I think John is absolutely right. Guadalcanal is at the very least postponed for 6 months or more. So it changes the dynamic of the whole war. And as Trent says, if you extend that thing into 1946, you got all sorts of political problems.
Let's stick with that theme, Craig. That's my final question. You talked about Nimitz being sacked. What if someone other than Nimitz had been in charge? Let's say Admiral Kimmel was not fired. These are multiple what ifs. But what if Nimitz isn't the boss in the summer of 42 and spring summer of 42 for Midway? Who is, and how does that affect the outcome?
Well, of course, the who is the critical part of that. If it's Halsey, I mean, you look at the personalities of Halsey and Spruance, almost as different in terms of their temperament, command styles as King and Nimitz are. So you replace someone like Spruance with someone like Halsey, and you get Bulls Run at Leyte Gulf, as opposed to keeping Mitcher on the tether at Saipan. Those are references that we may deal with later on in a different podcast. But and the same thing is true if Nimitz goes away and is replaced by somebody who's, I mean, I can't imagine Kimmel still being on the scene. That's just not politically possible. That isn't going to happen. But Pai was his temporary replacement. Pai as commander during the Battle of Midway, I don't think you get the same outcome. So, I mean, if I'm going to speculate, we had the right guy there. We had the right guys there for the Battle of Midway. And I think that was absolutely crucial to the final outcome of that campaign.
Right. Could you chime in?
Yeah, the most interesting question for me about Halsey potentially, being fit enough to command rather than Spruance is Halsey as someone who is able to have the kind of conversation with Mitcher to keep the flight from nowhere from happening. Oh, I triggered something with John, I guess.
Yeah, because that's absolutely right. Halsey gets this bum rap, oh my God, what would have happened if Halsey? And I think you're absolutely right. I think Halsey would have had a much better chance of actually keeping Mitcher on the leash. Mitcher might have told Halsey what it is that he's gonna do with his air group, so who knows?
Right. I was sort of teeing this up earlier, saying, Mitcher feels like he's got, the whole community of the brown shoes on his shoulder. Well, Halsey's one of those guys. And so if he feels comfortable telling Halsey, hey, I want to send, my air group up to the potentially second group. And if Halsey's like, no, then it is over by lunchtime potentially. So to me, that's a really interesting idea. But then of course, Halsey's so aggressive, goodness knows what he's going to do.
Exactly.
I mean,
the real litmus test becomes, what does he do that night?
Yeah, he doesn't.
That's a good point.
He continues to the west and gets himself in trouble with the Yamato.
Yeah, because there is still the, somewhere deep down, I think there is still the young destroyer commander in Halsey's mind. And he's like, oh yeah, King's been going on about how we got to use, night destroyer attacks. I can do that. I can use my carrier screens to go mop up.
and run into a pair of Congo class battle cruisers and you see what happens.
Yeah, oh wow, that would be interesting. Yeah. Savo Island off Midway.
Really bad.
Well, gentlemen, I feel like this is part one of what could be 18 in the series here. This has been really rich. I'm going to sort of catch John off guard. John, we've got two great new books coming out on the same individual by two great authors and historians who are friends. Can you tell the audience why right now, because it's available, they need to buy Craig's book, and then in September when Trent's is available, why that one needs to be added to their library as well, other than they're great guys?
Wow, that is just brutal. Look at you. Well, for a student of the battle like myself, I think you want to have both, just because they're both quality authors and they both kind of come at it from a different take. I mean, I look at Craig as, an emeritus, long time, big picture naval historian who's done a lot of biographies as well. But I'm also really interested in Trent's view because, as a fellow technologist, I'm intrigued by his approach to organizations as learning systems. I think that's a really valuable perspective. The other thing I'll say in defense of Craig, too, is that he does have the recipe for Chester Nimitz's favorite cocktail in there, the Sync Pack. And that is a big value add for a mixologist such as myself. So I think these are both solid purchases, and any serious student of the Pacific War is going to have both of them on his or her shelf.
Well, and they already have yours with Shattered Sword with Tony Tully. Craig Symonds, Nimitz at War, that's already available online. And of course, Trent Hone's Mastering the Art of Command, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and the Victory in the Pacific. Gentlemen, this has been a great conversation. I say that because I didn't have much to do. I just got to sit back and enjoy it. But thank you for coming and having a fun but important and in-depth conversation for this important anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Midway, June of 1942. We hope to bring this group together again in whole or in parts, webinar, in person, but congratulations on the books, and thank you for being such good friends to the National World War II Museum. Please do look at our website for upcoming events and webinars. Also check the comments section and make sure you're clicking on those links to further your knowledge on this and many other subjects. To Craig, John, and Trent from here in New Orleans, thank you all very much for tuning in. I'm Jeremy Collins, and I'll see you at the next program.